Welcome for another great day of grand challenges. Yesterday, I saw a lot of beauty, scientific power, but also energy. And I know today will not be different. It will be actually better because I'm here. Thank you for showing up again. As you saw, I want all of you to say the word Ubuntu. Again, Ubuntu. We are here together, and this is the way we have to continue working together in a world that is a bit more difficult. Humanitarian situation is increasing, but also we have the power to do it together. And the science is powerful. And I hear yesterday in one of the sessions saying science is not luxury, science is essential, it's critical to actually meet the issues of tomorrow. But we know that science cannot do it all. We know that we need the people matters, the community matters, but the context actually matters. And this is a good segue for those of you who participate to the tabletop exercise on Sunday afternoon. We'll have to, this is a way, how do we prevent, and how the next session will be about how do we look at the future of pandemic preparedness. Because as we saw, context matters, leadership matters. And with this, I'm really honored to be able to be part of the next panel discussion. And with that, I'll introduce and welcome our moderator, Don Inglesby, who was our fashion WHO on the panel. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks so much.
I'll also welcome my two fellows panelists, Johanna, Dr. Johanna Hanefeld, and Dr. Mike Ryan, to join us, who are joining us online. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you to Johanna and to Mike for being part of this panel, and thanks to all of you for being here. Really looking forward to this conversation. And in a moment, I'm going to turn to my distinguished colleagues for their insights about the panel, or the exercise rather, that we had on Sunday, and about pandemic preparedness more broadly. But let me just start by setting the stage a little bit and offering a couple of takeaways from the exercise that I have. So just for those who weren't in the room on Sunday, 2 days ago, we held the catastrophic contagion pandemic exercise right here on the stage. And in that exercise, we had an extraordinary group of participants, and Mr. Bill Gates, who participated. And those participants were current health ministers, or very senior public health experts from Senegal, Rwanda, Nigeria, Angola, Liberia, Singapore, India, Germany, and the US. So really representing views from many parts of the world. And the exercise simulated a series of fictional WHO Health Advisory Board meetings where participants were grappling with what started as a small epidemic in part of the world, but rapidly grew to become a pandemic. And in the exercise, participants were challenged to make urgent, very complex decisions on a range of issues with limited information, which we think really resembles the real world in these kinds of moments. And each of these decisions had both health and economic and larger social ramifications. And I think hopefully we'll talk about that today. And so let me start with a couple of takeaways and then turn to my colleagues to get their impressions of the exercise and beyond. So my first takeaway is that in the early days of an epidemic, and I think many of you probably already have experienced this, there may be a window of opportunity where containment is still possible. But very difficult containment decisions may be needed on a short time frame to be able to make those kinds of quick calls in a setting of data and science uncertainty. And in this exercise, even among a group of highly experienced and some of the wisest and most experienced public health officials and leaders, even after they lived through COVID and many led through COVID, even then, there were opposing views, even contrasting views on some really fundamental and important policy decisions, particularly around non-pharmaceutical interventions that might need to be taken or could be taken in the beginning of a pandemic. So for example, there was not unanimous agreement about whether travel closures, national travel closures, would be a good thing or a bad thing. There was not unanimous agreement about school closures and the extent to which schools could play a role here, should be shut, should remain open for kids. These are not going to be easy decisions, and I think we saw that in the exercise again, even now after living through COVID. And we should prepare our leaders, our public health experts, to confront them in crisis. We should not be trying to solve those kinds of problems in the middle of a pandemic. That was the first thing I took from that. The exercise also showed another pivotal question, which is that in future pandemics, if they have a higher case fatality rate, or perhaps affect different populations, such as children primarily, would countries take different decisions, perhaps harder decisions, more urgent decisions that lead in different directions that we saw from COVID? I think we should be asking those questions now before we get into that kind of moment. A second takeaway, there is no large reserve of public health expertise to fly in to help countries that are struggling or have poor infrastructure. And for that reason, in the exercise, we posited in the future the creation of a pandemic corps. A pandemic corps that would be built by countries themselves with external funding where needed. This is something that Mr. Gates described in his book, and we included that in our exercise, and it seemed that the exercise participants all really welcomed that idea in the exercise and in the discussion to follow, and then we're going to talk about that again today and get the views of our participants about that. But that kind of workforce that's working ahead of time, that's networked around the world, that kind of thing, we believe, we in our center, my colleagues, and I think others are beginning to believe would really be a wise investment for the world beyond everything that's also going on. A third thought, in future pandemics, we should expect that misinformation and disinformation is going to lead to spread of disease and higher mortality. We saw it with COVID, and there's no reason to think that we're not going to see the same thing in future events, and we should prepare for that. What we saw in the exercise is that there wasn't a lot of appetite or belief that WHO should be an organization that is in a position to try to stop that from happening. What WHO can do is flood the airwaves with good information, do everything they can to push science and fact. But countries themselves, either together or on their own, are going to need to be able to make judgments and use their own laws, their own processes, their own rules to try and stop those things from where they're emanating. And the last takeaway before we turn to the discussion is that public health leaders around the table in the exercise did not have confidence at all that countermeasures, vaccines, therapies, diagnostics, could be or would likely to be fairly allocated in the system that we have in place now. And that to do that, we're going to need to do a lot of work, even if we have widespread global commitment for equity in distribution of countermeasures. The implementation of that will be hard. How do we do that? Do we base it on need? Do we base it on case numbers? Do we base it on infrastructure? Many important questions that really we haven't resolved yet and are important work in the time ahead. So with that, let me now turn to my very respected colleagues and begin a conversation about the exercise and then bridge to pandemic preparedness more broadly. Let me start with Valerie. Valerie, it's great to be with you, and I loved the remarks that you just gave, which were quite moving and important. When you saw the exercise, what impressions did you have leaving that experience?
Thank you, Tom. Watching the exercise is almost feeling like a voyeur, where you can see what is going on in the box, and it's really putting the way how complex decisions are. And actually, Mike, I don't like your job, and I don't want your job, because it's really complex to have to deal with that. But something really came out really clearly it's difficult to make some of these decisions, but one thing is that it was barely the regional setting were absent, the national voice was absent. And I think that for me, we are in Latin America, I wish we would have, for example, the PAHO voice more speaking and giving them the option, or the country voices. That was a little bit absent. And then the other piece that came really loud is that although it's a public health, and we saw it with COVID, it's a multi-sectorial, but we were still focusing on WHO. But I feel like how, as a world, we have to look at it as a more multi-sectorial, and how do we do it? And this will be a challenge for all of us, because it cannot be just health. Health will not solve it, and we have to really think about it a bit more. The other piece that came really loud is that deployment doesn't solve the issues. And I think we saw the difference is that we need to have national forces and national capacity, and deployment only when needed, and not as a first option, because in a lot of time it's not work, and we can't have the staff for 2 years deployed. And that brings me to the last point, is about, or not the last, the before last, leadership. Leadership is essential at the country, at the region, at the global, will be important, and therefore we need to be better prepared, because we cannot, again, it was shocking, it was so real, but shocking to see how it was so almost same as COVID, when it will be in 3 years. What will we do different as a community, as a world? And leadership matters. We have to find solutions to not be able to do it again. And on top of that, we have to start thinking about context specific and the humanitarian, and this is a little bit my bias. We have to think that there will be some places where things will not work, and we have to think that ahead of time and not when we're already in the situation. There are places that we have to think about. Humanitarian sector are important, but also psychosocial pieces didn't come out. Children were not dying, but also they were having consequences of the thing, but there was no real action. And that can be, for children, that will be, families and community will be destroyed for life. Then I think that was some of the highlights for my...
Thank you so much. Let me turn to Johanna. You were actually, on the stage here, you were one of the participants in the exercise, so you have a particularly unique advantage, or vantage point, I should say. So let me turn to you.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you for the exercise, really, which was put together really well. I think for me, the first thing to say is really it showed the importance of preparedness, right? So we need to be well prepared. I think if I break that down a little bit, maybe into 3 areas initially, I think it showed the importance of information that you need, right? So we got some information presented, and then straight away we had more questions. And so in some ways you could say, oh, well, it shows the importance of surveillance, it shows the importance of data. Yes, it does. But I think the other thing it showed to me and demonstrated again is how hard it is to make decisions in the absence of perfect data, right? And you're never going to have that perfect data. So it's one thing I think it really brought into stark focus is you really need to understand how can you make decisions in a situation where you have imperfect data, and how can you judge that? And it's almost like that is a skill. I think that's quite important. And then I think what was really important as well was obviously the health workforce capacity, right? So there was a need to, or it was very clear that we needed the capacity to respond, and that capacity wasn't at the scale that it was, even though we were 3 years into the future. So I think it underlined really, really, again, to me, the importance of developing a public health workforce that is capable to act at country level, but act regionally and act globally. So this interoperability, which I think in our work has been important to me, came out again as well. And that, in a way, I also really valued about the scenario was it really highlighted the importance of trust and governance and those issues. So in this scenario, you had two countries who fared quite differently, right? And where the country that was the fictional country that was performing worse had all these spillover effects of a failing governance, of a health system that was being overwhelmed, of a political system that was being overwhelmed, and a social crisis developing. And that had massive ramifications for the population there, and it had ramifications for what we could do as a global community. So the exercise was obviously us set up at global level to respond to that. And I think to me that really brings it back to the very big message for me that the exercise spoke to, and the preparedness is that we have to build that trust, and we have to build an infrastructure that can withstand those shocks at a time when we're not in the heat of the pandemic. So I thought that was, that to me was very strong message coming out from the scenario. Maybe a last observation is that I felt it was a little bit unfair, and possibly in reality it may have been more complex, is that one country was doing really well all the time, and one country was doing really badly all the time. So I think maybe reality is sometimes a little bit more complex.
Fair point.
But just underlining, but no criticism intended, and just underlining the importance of the need to build those structures, the trust and the governance really over time, right, to be able to withstand a crisis, and the importance it has to our collective preparedness. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. And let me turn now to Mike. Ryan, you are a man who has been in the seat that we were trying to simulate, or advisor to the seat we were trying to simulate, to get that right. In any event, you're the man. And so tell us how it feels to be in moments like that and what you thought of the exercise.
Well, it was very nice to be an observer for once, I have to say. sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. With some light turbulence along the way. No, I very much same feelings as yourself and Valerie and Johanna. I think the essence there, and I think what worked well in the exercise, and your team does a lot of exercises. An exercise is it's a reflection of a perceived reality. It's never real life. What it does is allows you to play a game effectively and look at scenarios. It's not a prediction of the future. It's a perception of the future and what certain things might be like, and then how will we deal with that. And that's why we need more exercises. So we do that in our own lives. Football teams do that. Sports teams do that. You don't play the game, but you play the game 20 times in your head before you play the game. And you see that at the highest levels of sport. That ability to have the muscle memory, to have gone through the process. The actual process is never exactly the same. But having gone through that process, having thought through, and especially the relationships that emerge during a process like that, that's what's really important. So I was very realistic from that point of view. I think, as Johanna said, managing uncertainty. And I think beyond the issue of having deep uncertainty all the way through, because once you've answered one question, there are 10 other questions. So that you never get all the answers at one time. And being able to understand and accept that that's a reality. The other thing I think that has to be seen is that science and evidence doesn't equal policy. I can prove one factor, but the decision to act on that has so many other factors, social, economic. So therefore, translating science and translating evidence into policy for people and communities is very different. We saw that in COVID. Countries were faced with huge challenges. For some countries, it was easy to put in travel restrictions and have people stay at home when they were sick. But if you're a single mom in a developing country and you're going to work and your kids are not going to eat if you don't go to work, that's not the same choice socially. It's the same choice medically and scientifically, but it is not the same choice from a lives and livelihood point of view. So, and that's, I think, a fear politicians have. And listening to the ministers playing out their roles, I think there's a huge fear at the moment, Tom, is that politicians particularly, and having gone through this whole 2.5 years, they fear the retrospectoscope. When they're making the decision, they're thinking, how will this decision be looked on in 2 months or 3 months' time? And there is no forgiveness. I've seen it again and again. Reasonable decisions made based on uncertain data are then brought back through the ringer 6 months later, and politicians pay a price. Why did you make that decision? Why did you shut down this? Why did you close your borders? And they'll say, well, I did that on the basis of the information I had at the time. That is no defense. The media and the public do not accept that defense, and that's a problem. That's a real problem in having that discourse with the media and the public around how decision-making is made during events. Because then I fear that sometimes decisions are made and bets are hedged when bets shouldn't be hedged, when clear decisions need to be made. I was trained first as a surgeon, trained in trauma. We were trained to intervene and accept the fact that we would be wrong, not to wait for the full diagnosis, because if the patient is dying in front of you, you have to take action. And you accept consequences of not having perfect diagnosis. So it's a slight difference in mentality. The other thing, we'll come on and maybe we'll speak about the workforce later. I mean, Dr. Tedros has been speaking since 2017 about a health emergency corps. Bill has been talking about a pandemic force and pandemic response, and the German teams. Karl Lauterbach and the G7 have been talking about a public health response workforce. There's a lot of convergence now, Tom. There's a lot of people thinking the same thing, and I think that's huge momentum. And it's a real honor to work with you, with Bill and the team on that. And I think there's a huge amount to be gained there. But remember, we're not starting from nothing. We have 18,968 fully trained surgeons, anaesthetists, doctors, and nurses ready to go anywhere in the world, pre-qualified, pre-trained. We have over 100 institutions, or more than 250 institutions in the Global Response Network who've responded in over 100 countries in the last 20 years. What we don't have, and Johanna said it, is speed and scale, being able to do that at speed, at scale, with countries accepting those teams to come in. And that's why the national buy-in and the national ownership of this core is so important. People will accept teams when they feel they're part of the game, they're part of the process. What people feel very nervous about is taking teams in from outside and they're going, who are these people? What are they here for? What are they here to do? And there's a very much, and communities react like that too, and I'm sure Valerie could speak to them. So I think the idea that we build a global response force, a global pandemic response force, a health emergency corps, on the principles of national ownership, I think that's the way forward.
Thanks so much, Mike. Well, thank you for kind of segueing into that topic, which I think we want to turn to now. And maybe I can come back to Valerie to think out loud a little bit about this. So Mike started talking about this idea of pandemic corps, something that would complement the amazing work going on by volunteers now, creating the emergency medical teams, the GOARN Emergency Response Network, all of the work that WHO does internationally, regionally, locally. What do you think about the concept of building a pandemic corps based in country, supporting financially other resources that kind of bottoms up pandemic corps around the world, network together, training for future major epidemics or pandemics?
You say it well, you describe it well. I think we have to, if we take a step back to what's happened through COVID, and Dr. Tedros mentioned that, it's about solidarity, it's about trust across countries. And when we talk about pandemic, we don't talk about outbreak. Of course, a pandemic comes from an outbreak, but it's not just one country affected, it's the whole world is affected. And we have to think about it. When we saw during COVID is that countries were taking different decisions in the panic mode. And actually, it's not just the low, medium income countries, the high income countries. It was decision that was made in the detriment to the others, the neighbors. And I think the idea of the Corps is actually having this force who will prepare together, will work together. As you said, it's not about sitting somewhere and be deployed, but it's about integrating this Corps as part of the national level, but the role of the regional level is really important. And the idea is that they need to be dedicated people, professional, paid for doing that, because we cannot, Bill mentioned it the other day, yesterday, we cannot afford, because it's a $3 billion when the economic crisis of the pandemic, and we should be able to pay for people to be able to do that in their country, support the country, but also network together, exercise. As Mike said, you need to be prepared. As a team, you have to work together, because then you build the trust, then you build the dynamic around that, but also the the more important is like, how do we make sure these leaders in their country are the people that the politician will listen to? Because we saw it in the tabletop exercise, and Mike mentioned it. The political people have to also be part of it, understand the value, and see them as they are part of their team, because then only we can have this core. But I believe that it will take time, it will not work necessarily everywhere the same way, but we need to look at what it is. It needs to have a global forces, but we have to have specificities because each region is different, each country is different. And how do we look at that to give some flexibility for countries? But the other piece also, there will be countries that will not be. And I think during the table talk, somebody mentioned it. How do we have a package for humanitarian, for countries that probably will not be able to do that, and making sure that we actually see them as a priorities, not after the thought, but be included as well in a way or another. Thank you.
Thank you. Many great points. And let me add another related question to this as I turn to Johanna. To paraphrase Mr. Gates on Sunday, he said something along the way in the exercise, I think talking about preparedness generally, but I think it could be brought on Pandemic Corps, focused on that. He said something along the lines of, it's a good value to spend $1 billion or $2 billion to save 20 trillion. And which is a metaphor, I don't think he meant about spending that kind of money necessarily on this, but maybe. And so thinking about that, Johanna, your thoughts on the concept of a Pandemic Corps, and how do we approach it financially? Or do you have any insights about where that kind of money should be raised or thought about?
Yeah, so I'll come to the financing piece.
Great.
Maybe in a moment. But just to say, so I think it's very clear. I think the public health emergency workforce, or the workforce we need, is strengthening that workforce, right? So in a way, the term you use for me is perhaps less important, but the key is that it needs to be strengthened. And I think for me there are a couple of very concrete aspects. So I think given the aspect of trust, and given what we know about where response and detection happens, right? So for me, this needs to build from local to national to regional to global up, right? So I think it is important, Valerie already mentioned it is important to have regional and global connection, and to have that scalability and to have the interoperability. So I think that is key. But I do think we need to strengthen at the national level, right? We need to strengthen as close to communities as possible, because that is the sort of first response that we're going to have. And that is so vitally important, because I think it can be that arbiter of trust and the ability, and I think we saw very well in the exercise again about this ability to have a pathway to go in. You know, if you want to scale up, you need to be able to do that, and we know what happens when trust breaks down between a community and responders. So I think it's very, very important to strengthen that, and then I think it is really important to network that capacity, and there I think that's why regional and global networks are so important. I think the second point I want to mention or touch upon is obviously also to highlight that some of these networks already exist, right? So we can build on that, and we can strengthen them, and we can see what works in the EMT and in GON, what works, and how can we build on those successes. So I think very important to build on those lessons. And then I'm not going to comment on the actual figures, but of course, we having gone through a cataclysmic event as the COVID-19 pandemic, I think everybody, touched everybody's lives, and it's such a vital investment that it seems it's something that we all have to come together to invest in. So I think it's absolutely evident that not every country can support and finance this for itself. So I think we do need investment, and we do need to come together, and that's where the point that I think Valerie started with around solidarity comes back in. But it's not just solidarity; it's also, and I think we saw it again in the exercise on Sundays. Is you're not going to be safe in your country unless everyone is safe, right? So so we do need that investment. We do need the international community to come together, or countries to come together, and make that investment now. Thank you.
Thanks, Johanna. Well, let's take this and then kind of just begin to think about the long view and where we are in the world in terms of gauging readiness around the world. And so maybe, Mike, we'll turn back to you from your perch, from your platform at WHO. Where do you see countries being strongest and weakest at this moment in terms of their ability to confront a future pandemic after all has happened with COVID?
It's very varied, Tom. I mean, I think if you go to the north or the industrialized countries, there's lots of stuff. They count lots of beds, count lots of workforce, count lots of people, lots of technology, but they're weak in terms of resilience and agility and ability to move quickly, and that sort of, you know, they're kind of caught in a media 24-hour cycle. So long-term thinking is very hard to do. Integration of data is very hard to do. Big institutions competing within countries, you know. So you have different dynamics in a complex country, political dynamics, federal dynamics of subnational issues. So whereas in a least developed setting, and Valerie mentioned it, and I think Bill said something very profound at the exercise. He said, he looked at, I think, San Rafael, the country not doing so well, and he said, you know, I like the look of San Rafael because where we work in polio, that would be a good scenario. And I think that was a really good point, and Valerie made that point as well. 70% of high-impact epidemics occur in 30 countries which are affected by fragility, conflict, and deep vulnerability. So unless we deal with the issues there, and in those situations, there is no national lab very often, there is no national public health institute, there is no national center for disease control. The government is weak. There are often multiple factions fighting over land with people caught in the middle. That's a very different weakness. Now, in those situations, communities are often very resilient, very adaptable. I've been so impressed at how community health workers continue to work, continue to vaccinate, despite the chaos and despite the risk to themselves. So there's deep strengths in many countries in terms of their deep community resilience. So I think when we look at both sides, we can see lessons in strength and lessons in fragility and weakness. And for me, you need to be strong and you need to be conditioned. You need to be resilient, as Johanna said. You need to be able to go for the long haul. Any pandemic that occurs in the future will take years to pass through, as we've seen with COVID. It's not a one-week deal. It's not a two-week deal. It's a long-term process. And again, having that is very important. So from that perspective, I see strengths and weaknesses on all ends of this. And Dr. Tedros and WHO is working, you know, on a kind of a new architecture, 10 proposals to build a safer world together. Within that, there are key elements on data, surveillance. I mean, there's only two things we do in an epidemic situation that actually make a difference. Surveillance itself, developing countermeasures, all coordination, all of those things are great. But there's only two things we actually deliver. We deliver protection to the community, or we deliver safe, scalable clinical care. They're the two ways you work in an epidemic. All of the other things either make that more effective or less effective. Surveillance, public health, social measures, non-pharmaceutical interventions, mass vaccination, all of that either makes the community better protected or it enhances safe, scalable clinical care. And that's what we have to focus on. And each and every country has a different mix of drivers, both positive and negative in that regard. Yep. And that's why I think going back to that idea of national action plans for public health security, in some senses, global health security is an emergent phenomenon. Global health security emerges when you have strong national health security in place and you connect those strong national systems in an unbreakable global chain with the global goods, the financing, with the innovation, with the countermeasures. But if you don't have the national systems right, there's no amount of global band-aids are going to make the difference.
Thank you, Mike. Well, let me turn to you, Valerie. From where you stand and you look around the world and all of the work that you're doing, where do you see countries being strongest and weakest in their pandemic preparedness?
Where I see the strongest, and it's usually not the obvious, of course, as Mike said, data, sophistication, power, money is important, but it's the more important is where there's a trust built between the leaders and their community, where their community knows that they count on us, and where the leaders are honest, vulnerable to say when they don't know or what they know, and how they communicate and how they actually care about the people. For me, that actually is where the strongest. The weakest is usually when you have a too decentralized system with forces, power forces that are going against themselves and the division, but also where data are used to threaten or to make decisions as a enforcement. For me, that doesn't work. No matter how good the data, how good the decision is, people will be against you no matter what. And I think for me, these are the two opposites. It comes back again from what I said at the beginning. Ubuntu, we have to be, as a community, if people feel like we are together, then people will trust you, and then they will go with you on that definition. And that can be dead or alive in some of these communities. And on top of that, I think resilience from community, the more prepared the community are, and we saw it in community where they are used to deal with some of these outbreaks, some of these is actually the outbreak have served as a preparedness. They actually do better and faster decision because they are used to deal with that. And I think that's why the preparedness become really essential. And how do we work together, the solidarity, but also the coordination will be important. Thank you.
Great. So the importance of solidarity, it's so well said. Johanna, your views on, just you're studying this around the world. What do you think of countries' abilities right now? Strengths, weaknesses?
Well, I think Valerie's pointed some very important points out. So I think it's about how can countries come together. And I think one of the things is that it's not about having all the different pieces in place and ticking the boxes on the checklist. It's about how you bring those pieces together, right? And we've seen some really surprising things. And I think the one thing I do want to stress, that goes to the comment I made about the example, is also it's not linear. Most countries don't have it, it doesn't work all the time throughout a crisis. So, and I think that's also important in sort of avoiding finger pointing too much, right? Because there is no silver bullet, or there's no magic bullet in a way. It's about this ability to adapt that Mike was mentioning. And I think there's much learning to be done. So I think we need preparedness, and we need scenarios, and we need exercises, and we can prepare communities. And we shouldn't use resilience to perpetual crisis as a sort of cop-out, not to support those communities and invest. But I think there is something to learn about systems that come together and that are able to adapt in a crisis and then transform in their response. And I think there are aspects there that we've really learned, and I think we've really seen how important that is. And I think within that, for me, one of the things that stands out is people, right? It is about people's ability to come together. And I think that's why the health workforce piece, the public health workforce piece, is such an important thing, and the pandemic court, because it is about people who have learned together, who train together, who have a common understanding, common operational principles, who have gone through this process. And I think that's how trust is built, or at least a shared understanding, which can be a basis for some of that resilience. So I would say there's not one magic solution, there's not one thing I would hold up, but it is about creating the sort of principles and the sort of pathways that make it easier for us to come together. So thanks.
Great. So we're beginning to get towards the end of this session, and maybe we'll just ask a final question for each of you, Mike and then Johanna, and then we'll finish with turn back to Valerie. What worries you the most? What are you most concerned about in this realm of epidemic preparedness? You may have already touched on it, and you can bring it back up again, or if it's something else. And then what makes you most hopeful about where we are at this moment? Mike, let's start with you.
What worries me the most right now is amnesia. That wonderfully protective human instinct to, to sublimate trauma, because you have to live your life, you move on. We do it in our lives functionally, some of us do it dysfunctionally, but in reality, what we try to do is forget and move on. If we do that this time around, we're in for a real problem. Because as Valerie said in the beginning, the convergence of the climate issues, the livelihoods issues, the conflict issues, and the epidemic issues are such that the speed and impact of epidemic events is growing. So We cannot forget where we are today and what we need to do. On the other hand, my greatest hope is that human ingenuity. We talked about innovation, or Valerie talked about innovation in her speech, which was really good. But I think that comes from a really deep ingenuity in human beings, our ability to ask questions, to try to make a better thing. We have one thing and we try to make that better. That's the history of our whole civilization. And I think we have some things right now. And if we talk about workforce, we have some of the pieces. When we talk about innovation, we have some of the pieces. When we talk about cooperation and trust, we have some of the pieces. But none of those are perfect. None of them are really at the level or scale or durability or resilience or that we will need at some point in the future. What we don't want to do is scare the lives out of people out there. People are struggling right now. They're living with energy crisis. They're living with social crisis. It's not our job to shroud wave and warn people that they're all doomed and they're all going to die unless they put hundreds of billions of dollars into this area. It's time for us in the public health community, in the science community, to get down to work, to find the resources to do this work and get the job done. Our job is to protect communities, not scarify them. And I think the danger is right now that we don't get down to work. We just spend our time talking about what work needs to be done. So for me, amnesia, inertia, and then a great faith in human ingenuity, and particularly young people. I see it in my own team here, that generational change. The younger professionals we have, they're much more geared towards cooperation. They don't see solutions coming from one place, one organization. They're much more networked in their social lives. They're much more networked in their professional lives. And I think if we can leverage that, and maybe, Tom, leave behind some of our old ways of institutional rivalry and institutional one-upmanship, I think we can actually find a better way forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike. Johanna.
Yeah. So not quite as poetic as that, but I think what concerns me is also the sort of the fact that attention is drifting and that we do need that investment and we do need to make that investment now. So I think that would be my greatest concern. I think the thing I feel most positive or hopeful about is you could start by saying people, but is really the scale of innovation we have seen in sort of science and public health during the past 2.5 years, right? I mean, it was mentioned several times yesterday. I think in the plenary, the way the vaccine was developed, the way the platforms for scientific innovation have developed, but also how public health has come together and has come to the fore. And I think there's a huge amount that we have achieved. And I think there's a huge sort of realization also amongst that community, amongst that professional community, about the immediate applicability of our work and the importance of it. So I think we're in a good place in some ways.
Thanks so much, Johanna. Let's clap for that, too. And Valerie, your last word.
For me, amnesia, complacencies, but also the silos, vertical health, trying to solve the health problem without bringing the other sectors, for me is really critical. And then the hope, we are humanity, and there's so much possibilities. Science first, data. Actually, a lot of the world are now data scientists. So scientific people, everybody know about now data, strain, viral, variants, epidemiology. I think we have science that can help us, and we saw it. I have really a lot of hope, but I have hope in humanity and the complexity, but the humanity, as long as we believe in ourselves and we believe to stay together. And I'll finish with Ubuntu again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Val. And I will just say that having you as colleagues and having everyone in this room for this meeting also leaves me very hopeful. And with that, this session is adjourned. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.